and welcome to the last few hours of Ropecon 2018. It's sad, really, that the convention is ending, but we still have some time left to go through Dynamic Dungeons. I'm Miku. Some people know me as Stampede online. I'm pretty sure that none of you know me as Stampede online, but hey, whatever. And just a few pointers before we start. First of all, I have a lot of material here, and we have only like 4 to 5 minutes for this. So the tempo for this presentation is going to be pretty quick. I'm sorry about that. But even still, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand and I will try to give you a chance to speak, if we have the time. Great. About me, because I like to talk about myself a lot. Oh, there's a comment already.
Will the slides be available after the presentation?
That's a good question. I'm not sure where I would upload them. I mean, if you can come up with if you want the slides after the show, you can come and talk to me and I can email them from you, or if you want.
Thank you.
For example. Yeah, sure, we can do that. So, I've been game mastering tabletop games for 10 years now. I'm pretty sure that, like most of this room, has been doing this for far longer than I have. Probably. 10 years isn't really that long when it comes to dungeon crawlers and stuff like that. But what you need to know about me is that I started 10 years ago with 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. And I played that, or I mastered that, I game mastered that for like 4 years about, then I switched to Pathfinder. And then I game mastered that for like 4 years, and then I switched to 5th edition. And currently I'm mostly running 5th edition, but also other games. But when it comes to dungeon crawlers, this is my background. I have also played OSR games. I have not really game mastered them myself a lot, but I play in Lamentations of the Flame Princess campaign pretty actively and do stuff like that. So that's my background with dungeon crawlers. But the reason I'm here talking to you about dungeon design is because I think that there are a lot of good dungeons out there, but there are also a lot of horrible dungeons out there. And that's why I'm here. Let's start from the very basics. Let's start from the bottom. What is a dungeon? Now, I'm sure that there are people who know this history lesson already, but just to make sure. Dungeon comes from the word donjon, which means the Lord's Tower. It's used in Middle English and Old French. And this word was originally used to describe the highest tower in a keep. The highest tower, which was usually used to house like the most valuable thing in the castle or the keep. There could be treasures there. The lord of the castle could have his chambers there, or it could be a prison, for example. But later on, donjon was used to refer to the most secure place in a keep, which was later on usually underground. And that's where the word dungeon comes from. But what is a dungeon in a tabletop RPG? That's the real thing we're talking about here. Dungeons in a tabletop RPG. Because the literal word dungeon, like when we commonly use the word dungeon in tabletop RPGs, it has a different meaning. Am I right? Yeah, it has a bit of a different meaning. So, what is a dungeon in a tabletop RPG? Well, classically speaking, it's a place that is usually hidden from direct view. It could be underground, which is like, I think the most common type of dungeon in like old school adventures. It's just like caves. The caves of chaos come to mind, like from the keep on the Borderlands and stuff like that. It could be something like ruins or like old ancient ruins or an ancient keep that has been long forgotten. It could be something that is forbidden, a forbidden city, a forbidden place where you're not supposed to go because there's dangers out there, so of course you're gonna go there with your party. But, and generally like secret stuff, it could be some like secret passageway or like secret caverns under something, or like, for example, like Waterdeep in Forgotten Realms houses like these huge waterway dungeons under it, which are pretty secret. Well, not really. Like every adventure in Waterdeep happens in the dungeon, in the waterway dungeons, but yeah. In a tabletop RPG, a dungeon is usually a place where monsters roam and treasure can be found. And it's the place. A dungeon is the place where you go and fight monsters and get loot, and from that you gain experience points, because that's how dungeon crawlers work. But this is an important point, and I'm gonna come back to this point later on in this presentation. But in a tabletop RPG, a dungeon is a place to test the skills of both the players and their characters. And what I mean by this is dungeons by design should do just this. If they are designed only for skill checks and stuff like that, if everything in a dungeon can be passed by just rolling a dice, it's not really a very good design. If player involvement doesn't matter, then you can just like auto-play the dungeon. You can just play it yourself. Like you can roll up to like 4 or 5 characters and just put them through the dungeon and just roll them all by yourself. If player involvement doesn't matter, it's not worth it. Player involvement is key here. But what really defines a dungeon in a tabletop RPG is that it utilizes dungeon crawler mechanics. And what I mean by this is that in a dungeon crawler game, like when I talk about dungeon crawler games, I usually refer to games like Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, OSR games, stuff like that. So that just so you know. So in typical dungeon crawler adventures, there's usually like this land map, which can be a hex map like this one. It doesn't have to be a hex map, but like some very classic RPG adventures from like the 80s and 90s like to use hex maps a lot, and a lot of OSR games these days also like hex maps a lot, because hex crawling is cool and it takes ages. Also, about the maps I'm showing you in this presentation, I have a slide at the end of the presentation that credits all the maps and stuff I use here, so just so you know. But as some might have noticed, this is a hex map of Solemnia from Dragonlance. But here's the thing. When you're roaming an overland map like this, or like hex scrolling, you're not in a dungeon. Perhaps you are exploring a map like you would kind of like explore a dungeon. Like maybe there are stuff hidden in every hex of this map, so you can kind of like explore it. But it doesn't really use dungeon crawler mechanics. And the thing is that when the player characters enter a dungeon, the mechanics change. For example, if we are going from, let's use this map as an example. If we were taking a hike with the player characters from Vingard Keep to Salanthus, I wouldn't describe every farmhouse, every tree, every rock on their way there. I wouldn't. Instead, it would most likely it would be like, I would check that, yeah, so there are like 3 hexes on the way, and if there are like random encounters or stuff like that, I'd maybe roll random encounters, see if there are any encounters on the way, but otherwise, it would mostly be like, yeah, go there. It takes 3 days. Nice job. Or if there are any like important events during the trip, then we play those. But mostly, we don't play the travel itself. Because it would honestly be kind of boring if I just told you that, well, there's a path, you walk the path, you come to a fork in the road, what do? Well, what do you think? We continue on our way to the city, of course. Yeah. But, when we enter a dungeon, things change. The mechanics of the game change. The way the game is played changes. So, when you enter a dungeon, usually the GM describes a transition. Usually there is a transition. There is a door to the dungeon, which begins the like dungeon crawler segment of the game, kind of. And the GM could tell you something like, well, you step into the dark cave, and you can see like you feel the wetness of the walls on your skin, and it feels cold and damp, and it's dark and miserable because every dungeon in the world is dark and miserable. And then you would begin the so-called dungeon chess, where you move your figurines through the map and explore stuff. Now, there are many ways to do this. Some GMs like to display the whole map of the dungeon. Like, maybe they draw a map for you as you go, or maybe they have like dungeon tiles or stuff like that prepared so they can lay out the whole dungeon map on your game table. But usually there's no space. There's no space for that usually, so usually they just draw stuff. Or they describe the stuff to you, and you may have a mapper in the PCs or someone like that who actually draws the map according to the directions of the GM. But unlike in the overworld map, when you switch to the dungeon map, you suddenly begin describing every room, every object in the room, everything in the room. Because the way the game is played changes. So, the thing is that in a tabletop RPG, a dungeon is not defined by what the dungeon is, but it is defined by how it is played. Do you understand? So basically what I'm saying is, anything can be a dungeon if it uses dungeon crawler mechanics. It doesn't have to be a labyrinth, it doesn't have to be a cave, it doesn't have to be an ancient tomb or something. It can be anything. And I have an example of this actually. This map right here is something you'd get from the dungeon generator online, right? Have you guys used Dungeon before? Yeah. Great. So these kind of maps are pretty familiar to at least some of you guys. This is usually what you get from there. And this is pretty cool. If you're like in a hurry to run a game, this is pretty cool. This is okay. And this is like the classic view. When you think about like old dungeon crawler maps, old dungeon maps, this is what you see, right? And this is a kind of a dungeon. But a dungeon can also look something like this. So these are the Flying Ruins. This map is by Miska Feldman. And it was used in one of his Astroterra adventures. I forget the name of the adventure, but it is one of them. Yes, it can also be found from that A Dozen Dungeons booklet also there, which is currently available at, I think, Ateliers Paul, I believe, was selling it.
They are not paying me for this advertisement.
Yeah, this is a non-sponsored thing, a non-sponsored presentation. But this is an example. A dungeon doesn't have to look like a classic dungeon to be a dungeon. So the way you'd crawl the Flying Ruins is very similar to the way you'd crawl this. Because just like there are like 5 rooms here, which would have like certain descriptions written down and certain objects, certain enemies in them. It works just the same in the Flying Ruins. You have the different islands, which are basically rooms in a dungeon, and every one of them is numbered. Every one of them has like certain details about them. It's a dungeon. Great. Now, dungeons in dungeon crawler RPGs can be categorized in different ways. This is just one way, and well, it's imperfect, of course, and I'm pretty sure that any one of you could come up with different ways to like categorize dungeons. But we're going to talk about this one today. So basically what I'm saying is that I'd say almost any dungeon goes into one of these 3 categories of dungeon. There are maze dungeons, Gauntlet Dungeons, and puzzle dungeons. These are the 3 main types. Now, the type of dungeon you usually find in classic adventure modules or other like pre-made adventures, most of them are mazes. Most of them are maze dungeons. Especially like in the D&D modules that have been published in the 80s. Those are most of the time maze dungeons. Gauntlet and maze dungeons basically are categorized by, well, actually, let's just go to the maze dungeons, actually. So, maze dungeons are usually characterized by a few things. Most maze dungeons feature many hallways, usually long hallways. Usually hallways with roaming monsters, and usually hallways where you don't want to take a long rest with your party because you're gonna get stabbed in the night. They also, many of them have dead ends. So they have these kind of like fake passageways. So there can be like forks in the road where the player characters may choose whether they go like left or straight or right. But the thing here is that if 2 of those pathways take you to a dead end, what's the point? If 2 of those passageways take the player characters nowhere, what's the point? If only one of them takes them to the place they're wanting to go. We're gonna come back to that also. But the thing is that dead ends are a thing. And I'm not saying that dead ends are always a bad thing. I'm just saying. But yeah, maze dungeons usually have a lot of rooms to explore. And for some reason, many maze dungeons only have a few rooms with actual function. Now, when I say function, I'm referring to things that benefit the player characters on their quest towards whatever it is. At this point, it's probably the quest to the end of the dungeon. But personally, I think that the main fault, that there are two main problems in many maze-like dungeons. First of all, the dead ends. If there is no reason for a dead end to be there, its only function is to waste time. A dead end, what a dead end? Dead ends can be made dynamic. There can be a function to a dead end. Like, let's say that instead of the hallway just ending right here, let's say that there's something in the dead end. Let's say that the last panel of the wall at the end of the dead end features something. Maybe it has like some kind of a carving or some kind of a painting or some kind of lore thing for the player characters to explore. Something that tells them about the dungeon. Now, suddenly, the dead end has a function. It's there to make the experience, to enrich the experience. It gives the player characters knowledge about the dungeon itself. Suddenly, there is a function. The other thing, the rooms with no function, which are usually just there to like confuse player characters. This, again, these rooms mostly exist to waste time, unfortunately. So, my hint to you, if you're designing a maze-like dungeon, is that try to make every room in the dungeon have a function. If there's a room that only features one encounter, like let's say that there's a room and the only feature in that room is that there's a pack of goblins there, and that's the only feature. The goblins don't have anything to like benefit the player characters on their quest. The goblins don't have anything like a great magic item or anything like that that would like feel like looting, like major loot for the player characters. Then there is no point. Then it only exists to waste time.
Sometimes the room's function might be to set the mood.
That's good. Sometimes the room's function might be to set the mood, and that is very much the truth. But if the room's function is to set the mood, then there is a function. But that's a very good point. A room can be like seemingly empty, like perhaps it doesn't have any like real objects of interest or stuff like that, but maybe there's like blood smeared all over the floor and like claw prints or something on the blood, so the player characters are suddenly like, oh shit, there's something here. But it's not here, so that means that whatever made this is somewhere else in the dungeon. And suddenly, the room has a function. Go ahead.
I have to disagree with the assertion that you should have, all rooms should have a function, because empty rooms, or functionally empty rooms, give you space or location to include uncertain elements. According to the dungeon crawling rules, like random encounters, all that, and also it sets the tempo for the exploration, which is a major feature of, running through a maze. If you have a scene after every passage, it gets kind of tedious.
Yep, that's a fairly good point. I would argue, but this is just my opinion, I would argue that I would still not want to include such rooms, because in that case the tempo very easily becomes very slow.
Yeah. And
personally, I'd like my games to be like running a bit faster maybe. But I think this It's like an opinion thing.
It's about the mix.
Yeah.
Not
Sure.
too much of any other.
Maybe you can say that the function is pacing.
Yeah, that was a good comment from the front row. So know your players. Know what your players want in the game. Go ahead.
Another thing here, that the mazes mean that every time you go, you have a go left, go right. It's a choice. You should have something to indicate correct or type of the ending that you have there. Tools you can avoid all those stupid encounters and time wasters if you choose correctly based on the skills your trusted dwarf has or hearing of your elf, or let's be racist, even human assassins have valuable skills in leading the team past a rule.
Ah, that's a good point. Go quickly.
Yeah, about those simple goblin encounters, they have a function to deplete the resources of the party.
Yeah, that's true. But once again, this is an opinion thing, I think. But my opinion would be that instead of like wasting time with that encounter, if I want to deplete the resources of player characters, I just make the rest of the encounters like more powerful. That's what I would do. But once again, opinion thing. Go shoot quick.
This might be also an opinion thing, but about the rooms in the function, I think that if you have a castle, even if a kitchen wouldn't have any function to your setting, then or a castle without a kitchen would be quite stupid. So these kind of rooms are also good to have.
That's true. That's true.
But I think that's also a mood setting thing, because castle without the kitchen is a stupid thing, so the mood goes down. So then the kitchen has a function.
Yes.
But I'm gonna move on forward. This graph like here, right here, represents a kind of a maze-like layout. So, and here are I was trying to visualize the things that you don't usually want to do. But there are a few good things about this layout as well. So the basic point here is that in many bad maze-like dungeons, there are only like the certain routes that lead you to the place you want to go. There are only the certain routes that take you there. And the other rooms, there might be like a few rooms there that serve no purpose at all. But then there might be like a treasure room somewhere hidden like further down the path, which, well, a treasure room has a function in a way. It's loot and stuff like that. It could maybe be connected to this room instead, which would, because this room effectively has no function here except to be like a space divider. Or there could be like an alternate path to the goal you're going. Maybe this alternate path like takes you, like let's say that the evil boss has some kind of a chair he's sitting on, so you might find this alternate path and take the secret door, which takes you right behind his throne, so you can just stab it in the back, or your thief can stab it in the back. Get all the damage done. It is done. It might be easier. There might be some purpose to it, but this is just a graph. Here is a maze dungeon. This is actually one of my favorite, if not my very favorite maze dungeon ever. This is from an old D&D module for the Dungeons and Dragons expert rule set. And this is from Castle Amber. And so in Castle Amber, much like in other maze-like dungeons, you only have one path that you actually must take to like complete. There are only a certain number of rooms you must actually go to in order to complete the dungeon. And there are a lot of like these kind of filler rooms that don't really contribute anything to forward the player character's progress towards their goal. But what makes Castle Amber so good is that every filler room has something interesting in it. It has a piece of lore, it might have a piece of lore, it might have a cool NPC, it might have like some cool treasure, but in Castle Amber, well, Castle Amber itself is kind of bonkers. So the first thing that the player characters might do is when they enter the dungeon here, and they enter this hallway, they see two doors here. One leads them to their goal, but they don't know that. They have another door here on the right, which leads to this room and to this ring. This is a boxing ring. And the thing about this room is this could be the first room that the player characters actually enter in the dungeon. And the thing about this room is that it houses one of the members of the Amber family. He's immortal, and the only thing he has to do on his spare time is train boxers. Because he's immortal. So he runs the boxing ring in the Castle Amber, and when the player characters stumble into here, he's like, hey, if you can take on my boxing champ, I'm gonna give you money. And maybe information about where you are. So that's a very interesting encounter. Like, that's not something that just comes up in a random dungeon, just like randomly. That's very interesting. And it sets the tone for the rest of the dungeon. Because Castle Amber is actually like really bonkers. It's actually really crazy. And it's so much fun. I recommend it wholeheartedly. Yes, but let's move on because time is limited. Then we have Gauntlet Dungeons. Now Gauntlet Dungeons are usually very short in length. They usually only feature a few rooms with just like small connecting pathways between them. It's like a basic Gauntlet Dungeon has like 4 rooms that are interconnected, and in every room there is something. And in the last room there's like a boss or something. These are basically like mini dungeons, basically. Although a Gauntlet Dungeon may take, well, a very long time. I've been there, done that. But the thing about Gauntlet Dungeons is that they are very straightforward. It's always obvious to the player characters where they're supposed to go, and it's like the most obvious dungeon design. And usually Gauntlet Dungeons, the main fault about Gauntlet Dungeons is really the fact that because they are so straightforward, some GMs forget that the players themselves, there should be player involvement. The players themselves should do something, except not just be there for the railroad. So the main thing I want to say about designing Gauntlet Dungeons is, I'll give you a chance to speak just in a minute, is that every room, if you design a Gauntlet Dungeon, every room should engage the players themselves in some way. And engaging players does not mean, go ahead, roll perception, you fail. That's not engaging. But instead, like, have them actively do something. But yeah, go ahead.
On the point of player agency and the neglect of dungeon layout on the mazes, you have to have forks that reconnect and loop back into the dungeon to give you alternate routes of that, which is pretty important, especially with mazes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree.
Talking about the Gauntlet Dungeons, these are the best way to have a dungeon because they allow you to have an individual hero who is tested, tempted, lured, betrayed. And all this can be done when each and every encounter is not a test of strength alone, but of character. If you don't do it, then Gauntlet Dungeon is shit. There are no other choices.
Thank you. That's very good, and I really agree. And the thing about Gauntlet Dungeons is really that usually when someone designs a Gauntlet Dungeon, it is more for storytelling purposes or character purposes than actually like for dungeon crawling. Because, well, it's not really... Because Gauntlet Dungeon is usually, in a map form, it's just like a chain of interconnected rooms, and that's it. It's not really a challenge like dungeon crawler wise. But it's very easy to design a Gauntlet Dungeon to serve a story purpose, because there's the links between the rooms dictate the order of the rooms the player characters go in and stuff like that. So you have so much authority on what goes down in the dungeon and in what order, and you don't have to like improvise on the fly, but you can just like design. This is one example, an example graph of a Gauntlet Dungeon. Now here I do have a fork to a treasure, but that's completely optional. But usually when I do a Gauntlet Dungeon, I usually do design like one fork that's like usually very short, but just that it has to feel like, let's say it's a cave. And well, many caves have forks. So this cave has a fork. It's just a pretty small fork. And there are a few hundred gold coins at the end of that fork. Now you can continue the story. Great job. Yeah. Oh man. Damn the clock. Okay. Because these are actually, I think, the most interesting type of dungeon design are the puzzle dungeons. And actually, the dungeon on the right, the Crypt of Luantien, I have a full map of that, like a full view of that. I'll have a few. I have a full view of that in just a moment, but it's actually one of the coolest puzzle dungeons out there. But about puzzle dungeons, they usually revolve around a puzzle. Yeah, that's kind of in the name. And some of them, I like to use these things. I like to have a way for the PCs to manipulate the objects or the layout of the dungeon itself. I really like the idea of these kind of the Legend of Zelda-like dungeons, where there are ways for the player characters to actually manipulate the dungeon itself in some kind of way. And they have to use that to their advantage. But that's not required, because this can like be turned around. And many puzzle dungeons actually do it the other way around, so that there are ways for the GM, so to say, to manipulate the dungeons as the player characters crawl it. And the Crypt of Luantien is actually a very good example of that, because it's a dungeon which has rotating discs of rooms. And these discs rotate on certain intervals, and the thing is that the player characters have no idea that they're rotating. That's the whole point. So basically, you step into every time the discs rotate, it opens up paths, it closes some paths, and sometimes you might just end up in the same room where you just were. So the thing here is that the players themselves have to think. this is a very good dungeon if you have a player who's doing the mapping for you. Because they might start to realize that, hey, there's something fishy going on with this map. And then they really start to think, how is this dungeon playing us? And what do we have to do to play this dungeon? Puzzle dungeons are a very easy way to engage the players, but they might be difficult to run. And they might be difficult to keep together. And the thing is that puzzle dungeons, when it comes to dungeon design, these are the types of dungeons that take the most time to design. Because if you want to make an interesting puzzle that really works, it takes time. And usually testing also. So this dungeon has been tested quite a lot because it can be found online. And there are actually, if you Google, there are actually a few cool play reports you can find about this dungeon online. But it's really cool, I really like it. And I personally like the idea of the player characters, either the player characters themselves manipulating the dungeon, or the GM manipulating the dungeon without the player characters knowing. Or with the player characters knowing, that works also. Well, that's not a very good, let's just skip that. Don't worry about it, because I want to bring up another example. This is the floating tube, and I had a Dragonlance map before, and once again this is from Dragonlance. This map is featured in Dragons of Desolation, an adventure for advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And the thing about this dungeon is that besides the party that adventures there, there is only one being inside this whole dungeon, which is a golden dragon. And the minute that the player characters step their foot into the dungeon, the dragon is like, aha, I see that there's someone that has entered the floating tube. I will test them to see if they are worthy of my treasure. So the thing is that the minute that the player characters step into this dungeon, I will read this straight from the module. All doors are wizard locked. Corridors fill with the misty violet vapor that reduces sight to 10 feet. Inner stairwells, the spiral way, and the elevator shaft fill with webs. 8 doors at random are hidden behind an illusionary wall. They can only be found by touch. Every time the heroes choose a direction, they may 50% of the time move the opposite way they think they are moving. And just in case someone thinks about casting something like Detect Magic, everything radiates magic. This is like the trollest dungeon I've ever seen, and it's great. I run this as a part of my Dragonlance campaign, and well, it's so good. Just as a heads up, if you run this, you might want to warn your players first that there might be something shifty going on in this place, just so they know. But the thing is that the only real non-illusionary threat they face in this dungeon is falling from the floating tube to their death. Which can still happen. But every threat that does damage to them and stuff like that, they're always illusionary. It just tests them. It's a different kind of goal. But we have 1 minute, so features of a dynamic dungeon in a nutshell. And once again, some of these are my own opinions. You can come after the thing. You can come after the presentation if you want to talk with me. But here we go. No rooms without a function. No dead ends except if they somehow contribute to the overall design. No encounters without a purpose. The PCs have a motive to explore the dungeon. That's also very, very important. The dungeon is not just static but interactive. The dungeon has a clear theme and preferably some lore behind it. Preferably there's a reason for this dungeon to exist. And the most important thing, it challenges both the characters and the players. There's the maps I used with credits. If you want to come and chat with me after this, you are very welcome. But thank you very much. That was Dynamic Dungeons in a nutshell.